Okay, welcome everyone to this Prefer webinar, Methods for Patient Preference Studies, What to Use When. We have a very interesting webinar for you, but let's maybe first go through some practical details before we start. So this webinar will be recorded and made public afterwards, and all questions and personal information will be removed before publication. The studies presented today were funded by IMI, did not receive any other funding. This presentation and its contents reflect the view of the presenter, not the view of Prefer, IMI, the EU, or FPM. The views and opinions expressed in the following PowerPoint slides are those of the individual presenters and should not be attributed to any organization with which the presenters are employed or affiliated. Now, at the end of this session, we will have a Q&A. You can submit your questions in the chat during the presentations, and then during the Q&A session, you can also unmute and speak up if you wish to do that. If you have any other questions after the webinar, you can also contact the Prefer Consortium. So our agenda today, I will start with an overview of an initial identification of methods and selection criteria that we did early on in Prefer. Then Brett will highlight some of the selection criteria and how they can be applied to certain methods that we identified as promising. Then Jorien will give an overview of preferences of stakeholders regarding methods criteria and their importance in the drug life cycle. And Karin will then give an overview of a comparison of DCE with other methods. And concluding remarks and Q&A will be led by Brett. So let's start with the first section, methods identification and appraisal. A very general introduction maybe first is needed, but patient preferences can be obtained by using different exploration or qualitative methods and different elicitation or quantitative methods. Now, these exploration methods can collect descriptive data, but also analyze the subjective experiences and decisions made by participants. Quantitative methods can then collect quantifiable data, which can be analyzed or inferred using statistical techniques. But for today, we will focus on the elicitation method, so the quantitative methods. These quantitative methods can also be categorized into 4 buckets, so 4 groups as you see them here. We have on the left discrete choice-based methods, and these typically examine the importance of trade-offs between attributes and their alternatives through a series of choice sets. Then we have ranking methods. These use ranking exercises to capture the relative order of importance of attributes or alternatives within a presented set. Then we have the indifference methods. These vary the value of one attribute in one of the alternatives until the participant is indifferent or has no preference anymore between alternatives. And then we have the rating methods, and these use comparative rating approaches, often allowing then participants to express the strength of their preference along a scale. And depending on the method that is then chosen, these can provide information on preference weights, relative importance of attributes, but also trade-offs and preference heterogeneity. Now, in general, when we move from the left to the right of this figure, methods are generally able to answer a smaller subset of questions. But how now to choose a method among all of these methods? Choosing an appropriate method for your study is a very crucial step. And multiple factors can be considered in this process, including the fit to the study purpose and objectives to see that the method can provide the information that you're looking for, but also the preference-sensitive situation, cognitive burden of patients or for the patient, stakeholder acceptance, and available budget and time. And as I mentioned before, in the beginning of Preferring Work Package 2, we did an initial identification of those selection criteria that can be used in studies depending on what you're looking for. Here we give an overview, and later on Brett will also describe how some of these selection criteria can be applied to some of the methods. Now within work package 2, we use the following flow to identify the criteria and then apply them to the methods. We had a first step where we did a Q methodology study to identify the criteria. Then we identified the weight, so the relative importance of these criteria. And by applying those weights to the methods, we were able to assess the performance of these methods and then also do a comparison of methods. And out of that exercise, we were able then to identify 10 promising methods that can be used to inform decision-making during the medical product lifecycle. And you see those 10 here on the left. And then from those 10, we made a selection of 5 studies to be used in preferred case studies. And these 5 cover the different categories of preference methods, of elicitation methods. And those 5 were then also included in the EMA qualification that Prefer did, in which we also describe more in detail how these methods can be used. And with that, I would like to give the word to Brett to describe more in detail those 5 methods and how selection criteria can be applied to these 5 promising methods.
Thank you, Eline. So in the EMA qualification, as Eline had mentioned, we included points to consider for method selection. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the question is really why points to consider rather than a specific recommendation. And the issue is that choosing the correct method in any situation is not always easy because there are a number of factors that go into that decision. Throughout the project, the issue of the guidance on which method to use came up a number of times from both project members and external advisors and stakeholders. However, the reality is that providing specific guidance in the form of a decision algorithm isn't realistic because designing and implementing a patient preference study does not follow a cookbook process. So therefore, we recommend that researchers first identify which methods are capable of providing the information necessary to answer the underlying research question based on methodologic considerations, and then to assess which of those methods is most appropriate given the characteristics of the patients and the feasibility of conducting the study given current resources. Next. So with that in mind, for this purpose, we organize the points to consider for method selection into 3 categories: methodological, participant, and feasibility. Next. Methodological factors are those describing the specific requirements and capabilities of the preference elicitation method itself. These factors specifically address the ability of the method to answer the research question, and we'll go into those in greater detail in a moment. Next. Patient or participant factors describe the interaction of the sample in 2 ways. First, the ability of individual patients or participants to actually complete the task, and this often has to do with the cognitive ability of the patient and the complexity of the elicitation task. And it also has to do with the ability of the patient population to provide the necessary information. And that often involves the size of the sample, the diversity of the sample, and the access to patients to complete the exercise. Next. Finally, feasibility factors relate to the expertise and resources of the study sponsor or the study team. It's important to note that the methodological factors can also influence the suitability of a method for different types of participants, and it can also influence the feasibility of implementing the method given resource constraints of the study sponsor. Next. So first, let's look briefly at participant and feasibility factors. As noted above, the participant factors deal both with the ability of patients to complete the exercise and the ability of the sample, primarily with regard to sample size, to provide enough information to implement the method. When it comes to feasibility, the primary question relates to the expertise needed to implement a method or the ability to access such expertise. And it's important to note that feasibility may also be impacted by time and budget constraints. Next, please. So we alluded to the fact earlier that there's kind of a hierarchy among the categories of factors to consider, and we started with methodological factors and recommend that researchers should first identify the methods that are capable of answering the research question, and then based on methodological considerations, and then look at patient and feasibility factors to help identify which of the potential methods is most appropriate in any situation. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to focus on the methodological factors that can be applied to the 5 commonly used methods that were included in the EMA qualification briefing book and that were used in the case studies for IMI Prefer. These methods, as Eline had already noted, are Best-Worst Scaling Case 1, Best-Worst Scaling Case 2, Threshold Technique, Swing Weighting, and Discrete Choice Experiments, which include Best-Worst Scaling Case 3. Next, please. So we evaluated each of the 5 methods against 8 points to consider. First, some methods are designed primarily to provide sample level estimates, while others start with an individual level estimate and aggregate up to get sample level estimates. Second, some methods allow us to control for or test for preference heterogeneity and/or identify its sources. The third point relates to the minimum required sample size. Fourth, all of the 5 methods under consideration can estimate preference for individual attributes, but they differ in the number of attributes that they can address. Some methods focus on preferences for attributes or a single range for each attribute, while others focus on preferences for changes in attributes across multiple levels. And finally, some methods primarily estimate relative importance, and trade-offs can be inferred from the relative importance, while some methods do it the other way around, where we first estimate trade-offs among the attributes and then use that information to calculate relative importance of the attributes. Some methods, like DCE, directly elicit trade-offs among multiple attributes simultaneously, while a method such as the threshold technique estimates trade-offs among pairs of attributes. And finally, some methods can account for interaction effects among attributes, while others cannot. So we applied these 8 factors, if we go to the next slide, please, to each of the 5 methods. So if we look at the first factors, we can see that the DCEs primarily provide sample level estimates, although some estimation methods allow you to infer or recover individual level estimates from the sample level estimates. Threshold technique estimates a single number or an interval for each pairwise trade-off for each individual, and the sample means are a function of the individual level estimates. For Best-Worst Scaling 1 and 2, simple methods can be used to recover individual level estimates, or data can be analyzed at the sample level. And for swing weighting, each respondent provides a unique set of weights, which can then be aggregated to calculate weights for the sample as a whole. All 5 methods can address issues of preference heterogeneity, but the ways in which they address this differ among the methods. Sample size is a difficult subject because the required sample size depends on more than just the method itself. So the assessment for each method is somewhat vague here. And this is one of the challenges that we always encounter. But generally speaking, DCEs require the largest sample sizes, and swing weighting probably requires the smallest sample sizes. And as previously noted, all methods can elicit preferences for individual attributes, but the number of attributes each can accommodate varies. In general, the DCE and Best-Worst Scaling 2, because they are profile-based methods, tend to be more limited in the number of attributes that they can accommodate. Go to the next slide, please. So in general, Best-Worst Scaling 1, threshold, and swing weighting estimate preferences for each attribute or a single change in the levels of each attribute. In contrast, DCE and Best-Worst Scaling 2, again, because they are profile methods, almost always elicit preferences for more than 2 levels of each attribute. DCE and threshold technique tend to estimate rates of trade-off first, and then use that information to calculate relative importance, whereas swing weighting and best worst scaling 1 tend to do it the other way around. However, DCE can be used to estimate multiple trade-offs simultaneously, while the threshold technique tends to estimate one trade-off at a time. Best worst scaling 2 is a unique case because it considers multiple attributes in a profile like a DCE, but it considers only one profile at a time, unlike a DCE. So on the one hand, it appears to provide estimates of the relative importance rather than trade-offs, like best worst scaling 1, but it does so for multiple levels of a single attribute simultaneously, like a DCE. And finally, because they consider simultaneous trade-offs among a set of attributes, both the DCE and best worst scaling 2 can easily account for interaction effects among attributes, while the other methods cannot. So if we go to the next slide, please. So if there's only one thing that I would ask that people take away from this presentation, it would be that even with a small set of methods, the 5 common methods that were identified that were used in the prefer case studies, the performance of each method on the methodological factors is not entirely unambiguous. So while we can provide some general ideas and evaluate the performance of a specific method on certain methodological grounds, this really needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So with that in mind, it's important to understand that there are multiple preference methods available. And when choosing a method, the first task should be to determine which method or methods can address the research question. Sometimes this exercise leads you to a single method, but most often there are multiple methods that could provide the information you need. In all cases, once you've identified the set of potential methods, we then recommend that you consider participant and feasibility factors. However, throughout the process, the choice of method should always be guided by what will provide the right level of evidence to the decision maker. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jorien.
Thanks. I think we build further on the story. So if we look at different methods, criteria, what do stakeholders think is important? And we want to provide insight into, or further insight actually, into the suitability of methods across the full medical product life cycle, anticipating on the fact that different methods might apply across that cycle in order to facilitate method selection, but also the systematic implementation of measuring patients' preferences along this life cycle. And we want to understand the importance of methods criteria as presented to you by Eline and after that by Brad, according to the decision makers during the medical product life cycle for the decision points or the decisions that they actually have to make. So we want to evaluate the importance of methods criteria to fully appraise the performance of 5 commonly used preference elicitation methods according to decision makers. And those 5 elicitation methods are then the discrete choice experiment, swing weighting, thresholding technique, best worst scaling case 1 and 2. On the next slide, what we did is a multi-criteria decision analysis, and we used input from previous work in Prefer. First of all, we used the 19 methods criteria as identified in work package 2 and presented by Eline using this AHP&Q method. And what they also did in that work package, besides identifying the criteria, also is building a performance matrix that shows basically if a certain method complies to the criterion or not. And what we also did in work package 2 is make an overview of, as you see here in white, the medical product life cycle, and below that, the 3 decision maker groups in this life cycle, and the critical decision points for each of those decision makers. And with that, I mean go, no-go moments during the medical product life cycle. What we see in gray here are the decision points of which these stakeholders or decision makers think that patient preference information could be informative for the decision that they have to make. So if we go next, What we did as part of this study is that we've drafted a survey that we've disseminated among the medical product lifecycle decision makers. And that survey contained, first of all, some background questions, and after that, a description of a decision problem for a particular decision point. And then we've asked industry representatives only to evaluate these methods criteria for decision points that relate to their personal decision processes. And we did the same, of course, for regulators and HTA representatives. We asked them first to rank their top 10 criteria for methods from the list of in total 19. And when they had selected this top 10 of criteria, we asked them to distribute points reflecting how they rate these criteria against each other. Then we've calculated the value of each criterion based on the rating scores. And as soon as you know the value of each criterion, you can, of course, using the performance matrix of work package 2, calculate the value of a method. Because each of the methods either complies or doesn't comply with each of these criteria, so you add those values on top of each other. If you go to the next slide, here we see the first results of this exercise, and I made a split for what we see here is the 12 operational aspects or criteria that relate to operational aspects of methods, such as study duration, sample size, cost, and so on. I put a bar here at around a weight of 8, as we've considered 8 as a sort of a cutoff score for a criterion being top weighted. And what we see is that study duration mainly is a priority in phase 3 trials, and that low cost of the preference study is important very early in the medical product life cycle, which I think makes quite a lot of sense. If we go to the next slide, we can see these 7 outcome-related methods criteria, and the scale on the x-axis is a bit different, but also here I put the bar at a weight of 8. And you can see overall that these outcome criteria were more important to each of the stakeholders across almost all of the decision points compared to the operational aspects. Among the top weighted then are quantifying heterogeneity, and that is important in almost all of the decision points. Then exploring reasons behind preferences in qualitative detail mainly is important in the early stages of the medical product life cycle, as well as for HTA decision making. Later, we see that estimating weights and trade-offs for treatment characteristics is important in almost all of the decision points, and establishing external validity becomes more important towards the end of the medical product life cycle, including regulatory decision making. If you can go to the next slide. So here, these were the values of each of the methods criteria. If we then translate that to the scoring of methods, on the left of the slide, you can see that the thresholding technique and swing weighting score highest across all of the decision points. And then we see DCE to score highest in the late phases of industry decision making. If we split these scores up according to the different sets of criteria, as you can see on the right side of the slide, we see that especially for the operational criteria, it's the DCE that scores really low. And that is, of course, like Brett already told you, it's the one that has the largest sample size, take the longest time, therefore is most costly. And that all adds, of course, on each other. If we look at the outcome criteria, we see a different picture there. We see that DCE, thresholding, and swing weighting score quite high, especially as compared to the Bessor scaling. If we can go to the next slide, we did several sensitivity analyses. So what we see on this slide in picture A is the original scoring of methods as calculated as part of this study. Picture B and C reflect uncertainty in the originally published performance matrix of Work Package 2. And it shows what happens if we alter the performance scores. Like I said, we used a binary performance matrix, so a method could either comply or not comply with a certain criteria. So for each of the criteria for which in Work Package 2, there was some kind of uncertainty on the compliance of a method with the criteria, we use the opposite scoring. And you can see that that impacts the total score of the method. In picture D, we show you what happens if we assign a low cognitive load to all methods, because in the original performance matrix, DCE and best worst scaling case 2 were assigned to be of high cognitive burden to participants, while in the case studies that we had conducted in Prefer, patients or the general population, the majority of the respondents in these groups reported that the DCE choice tasks were very or easy to be understood and answered, and sometimes even easier than the comparator method. What we see in picture F is what happens if we acknowledge the fact that there is some proof for the external validity of a DCE. And then we did some further variations in picture E and G, but what I want you to take away from this picture is that the scoring in the performance matrix quite heavily impacts the scoring, the overall scoring of methods across these decision points. So not all methods criteria were equally important at each of the decision points in the medical product life cycle, and particularly regulatory and HTA decision makers. They put more weight on external validity and the exploration of reasons behind preferences in qualitative detail, so using interviews, for instance. And the use of the performance matrix, like I just told you, heavily impacts the total value of methods. And due to the ongoing developments in the field of preference elicitation methods, like for instance, the improvements that we make in the designs, in the analysis, due to those improvements, performance matrices of these methods should continually be updated with the empirical evidence that we gather, because these advancements go so quick. Besides that, there may be value in using a more detailed performance matrix that allows for a less strict value function. Like I said, we use this binary value function saying that a method either complies or doesn't comply with a certain criteria, but you could also go for a partial value function that might be more appropriate for certain criteria. For instance, if we look at the criterion on identifying preference heterogeneity, the current matrix shows that all methods are able to do so. And although something like subgroup analysis can, of course, always be conducted on the data that you retrieve for all of the methods, but only some methods allow for further investigation of preference heterogeneity, even within subgroups, by means of more complex modeling strategies, for instance, running mixed logit models or latent class analysis. So, although the DCE has historically been used most often to elicit preferences among these 5 methods, also best worst scaling, swing weighting, and the thresholding technique should be considered to address the needs of decision makers and stakeholders throughout the medical product life cycle if they would want to measure preferences or incorporate information of preference studies in their decision making, as also these methods comply with the top weighted methods criteria according to these decision makers. And with that, I give the word to Karin.
Thank you, Jorien. So Jorien and Brett talked on the comparison of methods agnostic to the specific case study results. And I will focus now in my part of the talk on the empirical comparison of methods specific to the case study results of certain case studies in Prefer. Next slide, please. In this comparison study that we did, we chose 4 specific ones from Prefer, because in a lot of case studies in Prefer, two methods were used just in order to be able to compare them between methods. And we chose 4 of them and 1 for each method. So in the first comparison that we did was was taken from the diabetes study, and it's there one can compare the DCE with swing weighting. And the second study that we chose was the case study on myocardial infarction, where both a DCE and a best worst scaling case 1 was used. The third one was the NMD study that was on neuromuscular diseases with a comparison between a DCE and best worst scaling case 2. And the final comparison was based on the RA case study on the rheumatoid arthritis with both the DCE and the probabilistic threshold technique. And depending on which method that was chosen as a second one, we could also look at different outcomes that were derived in those studies. For example, you can see in the last column that the outcomes that were compared between the different methods. Unfortunately, due to the nature of those different methods, these outcomes are not the same. So for example, the last comparison, one can, in the rheumatoid arthritis case study, we could derive the maximal acceptable risk, as that is the natural outcome for the PTT technique. And that can also be calculated for the DCE if there is a risk attribute in the DCE as a secondary outcome. But for the swing weighting, for example, one can only calculate a relative importance or a ranking, but not a maximal acceptable risk. Next slide, please. To give you an example how the different choice tasks look like, on the left you see a choice task for best worst scaling case 2. In this case, you see that there are 6 attributes and levels, and the respondent is asked to pick the best and the worst out of those 6. On the right-hand side, you see a task from the swing weighting. You see a number of maximal swings within an attribute, and the respondent is first asked to rank those swings from most important improvement to least important improvement. And then for each swing, it can allocate points that either add up to 100, so you need to divide the 100 points over the swings, or you can assign 100 to the most important swing, and then the other swings should be allocated points compared to 100, but less than 100. Next slide. In the case studies where 2 methods were used, the same attributes and levels were used. So this is an example of the diabetes study, where on the left-hand side you see the DCE task, and on the right-hand side you see this corresponding swing weighting task. This case study involved 6 attributes. And for more details on the case studies, I refer you to the webinars. For example, the diabetes webinar will be given soon, and others are already done and can be found. Or I refer you to the publications of the case studies, or in the case that they are still needing to be published, you have to wait a little bit, but then they can be found also. Next slide. To empirically compare the outcomes within studies and to identify patterns over case studies, we applied the so-called bootstrap sampling on the original data sets. So in this way, we could calculate not only the outcomes itself, for example, the attribute weights, but also assess the uncertainty in those outcomes. Bootstrap sampling means that you sample from the original data with replacement to obtain a new sample that may and will contain duplicates of the original sample, and then you estimate for that new sample the outcomes, for example, the relative weights, the ranking, etc. By doing this multiple times, for example, 500 times as we did, you can see the spread in the outcome, and you can construct confidence intervals, and then you can compare the outcomes not only as point estimates, but also by taking the uncertainty into account. As we have for each sample then the specific outcome for both the DCE and the other methods, we could also calculate the correlation coefficient between those outcomes, which would give a measure of association and an indication of the convergent validity. Next slide, please. To give you an idea of the results, here on the left, you see the ranking of the attributes of the diabetes study. On the x-axis, you see the DCE, and on the y-axis, you see the swing weight. It's a scatter plot where the rankings are jittered a bit around their value, so you can see the individual points. Click, please. So at the left-hand side, the attributes cost, that is in yellow-brown, and the precision, blue, are irrespective of the methods, the two most important. But on the other hand, alarms, and also alarms, that is in red, is the least important in both, according to both methods. But for example, skin irritation, which in pink, on the left-hand side, is more important according to the DCE than in the swing weighting. If you look at the right-hand side, we see one picture from the NMD study comparison. We see there that liver damage, that is in turquoise, is most important according to the DCE. So it's almost in all bootstrap samples, it got the ranking of a 1, but it's less important according to the best first scaling results. There it got either ranking 3 or 4. And the least important attributes, cognition in yellow-brown and blurry vision in pink, is similar across methods. Next slide. No, next slide. Here you see the same picture for myocardial infarction. You see a clear shift in the relative ranking, although cardiovascular death is the most important attribute irrespective of the methods, but the other attributes change with respect to their ranking. Next slide. In this slide, you see the maximal acceptable risk for serious infection, that is in red, and this is for the RA case study. Mild side effects in green and serious side effects in blue. On the x-axis for the DCE and on the y-axis for the probabilistic threshold technique. Only the MAR estimates for serious infections are quite comparable. The MAR estimates for the other risks are much more spread out for the DCE compared to the probabilistic threshold technique. And this might be due to the way the MARs are calculated in the DCE as a fraction between coefficients, two coefficients, where if the dominator is small, the fraction becomes really large. So small differences between dominators can result in large differences in the MAR. Next slide. A pattern we could also see when looking at the 4 comparisons is that compared to the DCE, the ranges in the attribute weights or the uptake probability range is much smaller for the other methods compared to the DCE. And this difference was most apparent in the diabetes study. So that's the middle one in this figure, where you see that the range in attribute weights was very large for the DCE, 45 or almost 46, and only 4.9 for the swing weighting. So somehow in the swing weighting, the weights are just like average out over all the attributes. Next slide. The association between both methods was assessed by Spearman correlation between the outcomes, as I've said before. And that correlation ranged between 0.35 for the myocardial infection study to 0.81 for the RA study. So except for the MI study, all comparisons show a moderate to strong correlation. And this correlation is the mean correlation over all the bootstrap samples. And then we could also calculate the confidence interval to that. Next slide. What was also insightful to see is that for all studies where the understanding of participants was asked, the understanding of the DCE was very good and even slightly better compared to the other methods. So although the DCE is commonly regarded as a task with a high cognitive load, in these specific case studies, that seems to contradict that issue. Next slide. To conclude, we found differences between study, and those differences were more profound when we compared the outcomes instead of the ranking of the attributes. And those differences might be due to the underlying structure of the methods. For example, in the DCE, there is a more explicit trading between attributes compared to best versus swing weighting or best versus scaling case 1. Other issues that might play a role are the anchoring bias in the probabilistic threshold technique or attribute framing in Bessemer scaling. And also said, as was also said before, the MAR is the primary outcome for probabilistic threshold technique, but it is a secondary outcome for the DCE. And then it can give problems when the denominator is small, so it can even blow up the estimate. Moreover, and it's really important to say, is that that there is no golden standard. So we cannot say that there is one grand truth that we can compare everything else to. So we think that we are not done. We need further studies where methods are compared. A lot is known so far on DCEs and their use for the medical product lifecycle, but more studies are needed on the other methods, on their internal validity and on data quality, but also to compare the methods between each other, to assess their external validation and how results obtained in one study with one method can be transferred to other contexts. Thank you. And now I hand it over to Brett for the concluding remarks and for the questions.
Thank you, Karin. If we can go, thank you. So just a few concluding remarks, and we already have some questions in the chat. But the conclusion I think that we've gotten from all of the presentations today is that there are multiple methods, some of which appear to be more promising than others, but even that conclusion is not unambiguous. It's very often very difficult to characterize methods by the patient and feasibility factors because there are so many issues that go into the conduct of a study that can make it very difficult to generalize as to which methods are going to be cheaper or faster or easier. So that is why I think we always wind up focusing on methodological factors and the ability of the candidate methods to answer a particular research question. We see that the different methods yield different numeric results, but one of the things that we notice as well is even in cases where we may see different numeric results, we often see that the results would lead to the same conclusion. In other words, they wouldn't be contradictory. It's more a matter of magnitude than it is direction. That's not always true, but as we apply these to decision making, I think for me, the question becomes how important is the exact number when it comes to informing a decision? And then finally, I would say, one of the best things about the work that's been presented here is the comparisons of methods. And I would love to see additional empirical comparisons of methods to continue to flesh out some of these differences and to see if we begin to see patterns as certain types of comparisons are repeated. So with that, I will turn to questions. And the first one in the chat is from